Margaret's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear, both emotions clearly visible in her eyes. She began murmuring prayers under her breath, but in an instant, an invisible force violently flung her back from the couch. Letting out a short scream, Margaret crashed to the ground, and an eerie silence once again enveloped the room. Lucy, her hands trembling and face pale, stared at Margaret with wide, terrified eyes. Her voice broke as she stammered, "Please, you have to help us." "I can't lose my daughter." Margaret sighed deeply, imagining herself in a similar situation years ago. She said, "This is exactly what happened to my family. And now that I'm here, I can't just stand by and do nothing." She glanced at Lucia, whose face was now marred with scratches and wounds that seemed otherworldly. Lucia, overwhelmed with pain and terror, managed to whisper, "Can you help me?" Margaret stepped closer. In the dim light of the room, she saw a strange resemblance between Lucia and her own lost daughter. Tears welled up in her eyes as she embraced Lucia and whispered, "I won't let this nightmare continue. I promise." The night quickly deepened, plunging the house into an unsettling quiet. While the family, drained from hours of anxiety, eventually fell asleep, Margaret remained awake on the living room couch. She listened to the wind howling outside, her heart filled with an inexplicable sense of dread. Just as her eyes grew heavy for a moment, a blood-curdling scream pierced through the silence, echoing from the children's room. The scream shook the house to its core, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing against a wall. Moments later, Lucy, her husband, and the rest of the family, half asleep and terrified, rushed to the children's room. When they opened the door, the sight before them froze the blood in their veins. The room was in chaos. The curtains were violently swaying as if some unseen force was toying with them. Lucia's bed was overturned, and she was curled up in a corner, trembling. Her brother lay unconscious beside the bed. But the most horrifying sight was the dark shadow on the wall, shifting and twisting as though it were alive, its shape ever-changing, filling the room with a suffocating presence. Margaret entered the room, her eyes fixed on the shadow. It was as though she could see something others couldn't. Taking a deep breath, she declared firmly, "You have no place here. Leave this family alone." Instead of retreating, the shadow grew larger. The room's light flickered and went out, leaving only the pale moonlight streaming through the window. Suddenly, faint, incomprehensible whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The family stood frozen, as if paralyzed by the unknown force that made their hearts stop. Lucia was levitating in the center of the room, her body twisted in unnatural ways. Her face looked monstrous, and her eyes were entirely black, as if they were staring into an abyss. A guttural, incomprehensible sound escaped her lips, a sound that no human could produce. Out of nowhere, Lucia raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at Margaret. Her face contorted with rage, and she let out a scream so piercing that it felt like a wave crashing into everyone in the room. Austin slammed against the wall. Lucy fell to the ground, and Margaret, though shaken, managed to stay on her feet. Gasping for breath, Margaret quickly retrieved an old book from her bag. Its worn leather cover bore ancient inscriptions of sacred prayers. Flipping through the pages with trembling hands, she began reciting the words aloud. Her voice started softly but grew stronger with each syllable, filling the room with a commanding power. Lucia, still levitating, began to shudder violently. Her terrifying appearance started to fade, her blackened eyes regaining their natural color. Slowly, her body descended until she collapsed onto the floor. Lucy, tears streaming down her face, rushed to her daughter's side, cradling her in her arms. Her sobs broke the heavy silence. But Margaret wasn't done. She looked at Lucy and Austin with urgency in her voice. "This isn't over. The spirit is still within her. We must act quickly or it will return." Austin nodded in desperation, lifting Lucia and placing her on the bed. Following Margaret's instructions, they tied her hands and feet with sturdy ropes. Though unconscious, Lucia's breathing was shallow, and every labored breath tore at Lucy's heart. Margaret knelt beside the bed, opening the book again. She began reciting ancient prayers, her voice rhythmic and steady. As she continued, the intensity of her chanting grew, echoing with a strange resonance throughout the room. Suddenly, the house itself seemed to react. The walls trembled, objects on the shelves toppled, and the very air felt charged with an ominous energy. A low, haunting growl reverberated through the house, as if the entity itself was crying out in anger. Lucia's body writhed on the bed, the ropes straining against her movements. Her head turned sharply, and from her mouth came a deep, otherworldly voice. "You cannot banish me. This body is mine." Margaret, unwavering, glanced at Austin and said firmly, "Hold her down. Don't let the entity gain full control." Austin, shaking but determined, stepped forward and pinned his daughter's legs. Lucia's twisted face turned toward him, her blackened eyes brimming with rage. She let out an unearthly scream that echoed through the room. Margaret's prayers, though powerful, weren't enough. Realizing she needed to take a more drastic step, she turned to a page in her book labeled "The Curse of the Spirits." With hesitation but resolve, she began chanting the ancient, forbidden incantation. The room grew colder. A shadowy mist seeped from Lucia's body, coalescing into a dark, shapeless figure that filled the room. The entity thrashed and roared, its presence nearly overwhelming. Margaret's voice grew louder, her words piercing through the chaos. Finally, with a deafening shriek, the spirit fled, disappearing into the night. Lucia collapsed, her body limp and lifeless, but her face was peaceful. Lucy rushed to her daughter's side, holding her tightly. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "It's over, my love. You're safe now." Margaret, however, fell to her knees, visibly aged and weakened. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as she spoke softly. "She's free, but that entity might seek another victim." From that night on, Lucy's family treated Margaret as one of their own, forever grateful to the woman who had sacrificed so much to save their daughter.